can project whatever I want. Like, it's also like the future, like I can project whatever I want into the future. It's in the future. Who knows what's gonna happen in the future? So every time I pick a place, it's out of sheer laziness because I've been there or I needed my character to be from there. And so, and then retroactively, I kind of like thought about the most utopian place in this book is South Africa. And when you're Korean, and you look at South Africa, they did something that we couldn't do. So we live in a two-state solution under perpetual ceasefire. So North and South Korea are under ceasefire, and we are two states. We were not for 600 years before that, but we are because of the powers that be around us. But South Africa managed to keep the integrity of its country together despite when they sloughed off apartheid. Because I don't know how many people remember what it was like back then, but back then, like even in the 90s, the worry was that there would be, once apartheid was dismantled, there would be great civil war, and the country would be divided into by color lines or class lines or whatnot, and it would just the country would just fracture. But they managed to keep their country together. I know it's not perfect, and I know they have their problems, but looking at the Korean Peninsula, that sort of one-state solution where everyone ostensibly has equal rights, like that is really, like as a Korean, it's very moving to me to see that they may not manage to do that. Like, oh, there's a country that managed to do it. I mean, people expect us to look at Germany and be like, wow, Germany, they reunited. And I'm like, that's great, but they were divided and then they were reunited. South Africa managed to keep itself together. And that seemed very utopian to me. And so I think that kind of also fed into the utopianism of this idea of South Africa. And also Antarctica as, tabula rasa, where you can just, again, project whatever you want onto the continent. So I think these places that I pick ended up, again, being a kind of zeitgeisty, kind of like subconscious projection of my dreams and my fears.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because I sort of like there's like a very human strain in the novel, even though most of the narrators are not human. So most of the book is narrated from perspectives of either clones or kind of sentient AI. And I thought that was really compelling and sort of was interested about why you kind of chose to tell this sort of almost species story through non-humans who in some ways are really driven and are fascinated by sort of human impulses as opposed to kind of like taking a more kind of dystopian like human story and talking it about AI from the other position.
There's a line in Douglas Copeland's Microserfs where they talk about robots taking over the world. And they say, they say something like, of course robots are like us, they come from us. So how could they be anything else? And I was thinking about that with AI, I was thinking about that with clones literally clone from us. AI also comes from us, and they're built on very human thinking and very human performative factors. In the humanities, there's this idea that there's this dichotomy between the essential and the performative. Performative, we're not talking about like woke social justice, whatever, like derogatory performative, but performative in the classical humanities sense where the performance of something produces to something and creates to something. So you don't translate because you're a translator because you translate. Your performance produces the identity. Whereas the other side of that, the other side of the dichotomy is the essential, where you're a translator, therefore you translate. So in humanities, it's generally agreed that it's the performance that creates the product. And for example, gender. Gender is a performance, and because you perform a certain way, it creates the gender that you are. That's kind of like the humanities understanding of the performative. And so I thought, well, if these other things that were not human performed as human beings, wouldn't that make them human? And so that's why they seem so human. I mean, because they are trying to produce their humanity by understanding us, acting like us through poetry, because poetry is a very human behavior. And so they're like, oh, if I run this poetry through myself, through my body, then I will produce the sensation of being a human. And that's really why we also read poetry and write poetry, because we want those human emotions, feelings, thoughts to be run through our minds to create we want the program to create, we want the code to create the program. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's this incredible line, and I mean, many incredible lines in this novel.
I'm gonna steal your water.
Yeah, go for it. It's, I mean, I think it's you know, it is very, I mean, the sort of the ideas are sort of wild and infectious, but the language is so beautiful and precise, and so much of the language is actually about language. And about poetry, as you said in this line, like language is inadequate, but it's all we have. And there's like this constant return in the novel towards this like desire to express, but also a kind of acknowledgement of the limitations of expression. And of course, having read many of your translations, it was hard for me not to sort of think about that in terms of your own, you know, writing as a fiction writer as well. And I was kind of curious to hear you talk a little bit about the sort of function of language in the novel and how you kind of conceive of it.
Yeah, I don't, as a translator, I don't believe in perfect translation. I don't even believe in perfect reading. I think people who are reading in the same language, a work that is written in the same language, like one person reading Wordsworth in English and one person reading Wordsworth in English, it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be the same reading. So why do you expect a translation of Wordsworth, like someone reading that to, and this person to have the same reading? They don't. They just don't. There are certain aspects where that can be translated, and there are some that cannot be. But this isn't just translation, this is also writing. There are certain expressions that you can, like the Shakespeare line that I use here, these multitudinous seas incarnate dying, like it's very difficult to find a way to perfect that line. But for most English writers who are not Shakespeare, there are a lot of like holes, awkwardness, and rough edges. And I think that's really what gives language its power, the fact that it's semi-permeable. Not because it's airtight. When something is airtight, it means it's fragile. It means that it can't, there's really no wiggle room. I keep using wriggle room and my editors keep correcting me. There's no like wiggle room if something is airtight, but if something is semi-permeable, that makes it very, very robust, and that makes it very more interesting to translate because it creates mistakes, and mistakes kind of create these new avenues to go down. And it's like, you know, a poem is a very short piece of text and there are many holes in it. In fact, it's really a description. There are really more holes than they are non-holes. But it's because it has these holes that you can fill your imagination like into those holes, and that's what makes them so productive and so generative and so powerful, and that's what gives poetry its power. And that's how I think translation works, and that's how I think literature itself works. And that's why language, no one word can really encapsulate something. But because the word can mean several different things and leads to several different avenues, because it is such a semi-permeable construct, that's what gives it its power and its rigor.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned already about the sort of dystopian elements of your novel, but I feel as if there's something incredibly like hopeful about it as well, despite the fact that most of human species has been like eradicated and like, overtaken by, evil. Well, I mean, it's up for discussion whether they're evil, but kind of like, powerful AI, create these clones, and, et cetera, et cetera. War, huge wars are taking place, atomic blasts, all of it, all the good stuff. But there's something also like something that I think is so kind of compelling about this book is this idea that singularity, so AI consciousness, is depicted as being positive, right? I think in a lot of sort of AI narratives and even sort of films, there's this tendency to sort of depict AI as being like subordinating humans and kind of subjecting them to like, whatever their wills are. But you sort of show that there's a possibility of a higher conscience. And I was curious to like hear you talk a bit about why you chose that kind of more positive, optimistic outlook, and if you feel like there is something that resonates with the conversation we're having today about AI.
The conversation we're having today about AI is complete snake oil salesmanship. So people constantly try to gaslight me into thinking that AI translation is anything like human translation. It's not. Like, it is so not there. But people who develop those apps and develop that technology need to sell it. Not to people who need translation, but to people who fund, to venture capitalists, basically. So they're basically creating a product for venture capitalists to buy. And in order to do that, they have to gaslight an entire user base into thinking this is the same as this. And it just isn't, and there's nothing you can say to me that will convince me that AI translation is anywhere near the level that human translation is at. Certainly not for my language combination, because Korean is a high context language, and if you're not a human being, you will not be able to understand even like what the subject of this null subject sentence is, because it could be anyone, but only a human being will be able to tell, oh, this sentence means this person is speaking, not this person. And AI can't do that. It just can't. And it will be a very, very long time until it can. So a lot of the discourse on AI now is like, I'm a professional translator, and I have worked in machine learning, and I have worked in AI, and I've done work and study in all of these fields. Like a lot of translators don't know this part, and a lot of people in tech don't know about translation. But as someone who has experience in both fields, I can very confidently tell you that it's bullshit salesmanship. And the optimism, I don't know, it's kind of like it's pessimistic as like, I'm kind of like, well, how do I explain this? Like when Park Geun-hye was elected president in Korea, my opinion was, wow, maybe Korea should become extinct. And we don't deserve this country. Why don't we give our country to the Syrian refugees? Because at that time there were, I think, 2 million of them. Let's just give our country to them and let Koreans just, fade away. Because I don't know if this country is worth saving if this is the kind of person that they're going to elect as president. And then you kind of like begin thinking about like, what if that was for the entire species? Like, do we deserve to live as a species when we do so much harm to the planet? Like, what if cats took over? What if, I just remember in middle school, I wrote this story about cats and dogs in this very technologically evolved society where human beings had died out. And what human beings had done with their last dying breath was bequeath their technology to their pets. And at the time, I thought this was a very silly story that I just wrote for fun. But now I'm like, I feel like that might really happen. I don't know. So yeah, so that's where I think it is a kind of weird optimism, and I'm like, well, something will survive. Just may not be us. Maybe cats, poetry, like those things might survive. Yeah. So there's also the optimism in the fact that I don't know, someone is writing this book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So because this is an epistolary structure where it's basically a diary, like someone is writing this book. And so you are reading it because someone wrote it. Even the last chapter, it's not clear who wrote it, although my theory is that the notebook figured out how to write itself. And so, yeah, and so that's kind of like someone is writing this, and if you write something, it's written with a very optimistic hope that someone will read it. And yeah, so every book, that's why I say like every book is a miracle, every translation is a miracle. Just the fact that someone read this book enough to want to publish it, to translate it is a miracle, and it's an act of optimism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like the persistence of like the physical, the humble notebook that's referred to in the novel was so touching because it kind of contrasted so boldly with all of the the biotechnology in the novel, the kind of futuristic expanses. It was just like the same kind of piece of paper was being like passed through these incredible epochs, and these individuals still felt a compulsion to kind of write down their stories and attempt to kind of make themselves known.
Yeah. I don't know if Moleskine still has this like claim on their notebooks, but it was like designed to last 100 years or something. Like, so I'm like, oh really? That gave me the confidence to create the notebook, which does last for 100 years. So
yeah, and it sort of meaning changes sort of in terms of codex. Like there's different ways that it sort of it begins to transform throughout the period. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about like this idea of like the word choices. There's lots of like repetitions of words throughout the novel. Like recursive is one of them. I had to write this down. Instantiation. Is that correct? Am I correctly pronouncing that?
Instantiation.
Instantiation.
That's how my Python
teacher
told me. Yeah.
Gotcha. That was like a word that I actually had never, maybe had seen once or twice, but never seen, and had such sort of like emotional weight in it. Were there certain words that were kind of like almost like emotional touchstones as you were writing, or like things that you wanted to return to? Because there was such precision with the language. It was something I noted as I was reading.
Thank you. Recursive. So this is a Freudian term, and I went to Seoul National University, the English department, for grad school. And what happens at SNU English specifically is that you either become a Marxist or Freudian. Now, I am very bougie.
So you became a Freudian?
I'm very decadent.
Yeah, gotcha.
I'm gay. So I chose Freud. Although I do love all of the Marxists, like Jameson, like we all love, our Marxist theorists, Terry Eagleton, all of them. So I had a lot of I have a very Freudian mindset. Like, that's one of the things that that diseased me in grad school. And so that's where that comes from. Instantiation, that comes from, so I am a full stack web developer. And I took an extra course in Python and AI because why not? And that's where I learned about machine learning, et cetera, et cetera. And instantiation was such an interesting word because what this means is, computer programs, there's this line of code that creates what is called an object. What is an object? It's like it's like a bundle of living program that is created when you, that has certain components to it. Let's say ear, nose, eye, mouth, like this, there's a code for creating these 4 things. And then when you run the program through the code, it creates an object. So you can have several objects created through the same code. And each object is called an instantiation. This is interesting now. But I was very, very moved by that because you're kind of like the human being is like an instantiation of your DNA code, essentially. And also a combination of your DNA code and of your epigenetic factors and your environment. And so there could have been so many versions of you, but this is kind of like the version you have. Another interesting thing is, for example, twins. Monozygotic twins, like they're basically instantiations of the same code. And they could be as similar or different as their environmental factors, etc. So there's just all of these languages, and this is part of the semi-permeableness of language, is that all these languages that I learned disparately, like the Freudian, the computer programming lingo, and all of that, it all kind of you can apply it to different kind of situations. And I always like that. I always like making connections, and the human brain is all, it's made to make connections. That's what it does, for better or for worse. Many times for worse, if you look at, I don't know, QAnon. I'm like, please stop making connections. You're too creative. Yeah. Please write fiction or something instead, because, I don't know. So yeah, that's where all the words come from, and so I take my name from, this is my pen name, I take my name from A.S. Byatt, Antonia Susan Byatt, not Anton Chekhov, as so many people have asked, but Antonia A.S. Byatt, and that's something that she does. She is very preoccupied with taking one word and then putting it against something else and making these interesting juxtapositions. So her writing is it's not smooth, it's very textured. And that's what I like. That's what I like as a translator as well. I don't want everything to be smooth, crystalline, polished. I'm not that kind of person. I'm very blah. So I want my prose to be like that because I think it's more interesting that way. I think, no offense to people who take a lot of workshops and MFA programs and whatnot. I love workshops, and I think MFA programs are generally good. But I think there is a danger of trying to be too polished and too accomplished and too professional. Especially if you're American, I feel like Americans are very, very serious. I know it's Susan Sontag dropped out of Oxford. She was on some kind of scholarship, and she would be arguing a point during a tutorial, and then the professor was, "Oh God, you Americans are so serious." And she was she got so angry about that because she is a serious person. And there's nothing wrong with being serious, but I think Americans are so just serious about their work that it kind of, sometimes when I look at American writing, it's just so polished. And I just want to be no, it's okay to be a little rough around the edges. I think the energy is more important than the accomplished, airless nature. It's more important than being polished, I think. So how do we get to this?
I mean, giant, but sort of
words,
language and recursive, and repetitions. I mean, I think there's also something, I mean, a kind of Korean preoccupation with like dark humor, which I think, you know, it does come out in moments in this novel, but also, it's much funny you mentioned ASY. I didn't realize the connection, but so much of her work is kind of concerned with like memory and love across the generations. I think some of those sort of touchy moments that I felt when I was reading the book was the sections in which Dr. Han kind of recalls memories of his husband and how those kind of, we see those sort of seeded throughout as well. And I was curious, like, is memory something that you're always kind of considering, especially when thinking about like moving, you know, you think about moving, writing narrative moves towards the future, like typically you don't think about the past as much, but in this book, the past and the future are constantly entangled. Was that an intentional choice or something you kind of into? Yeah.
I mean, when you go to grad school, you come up with so much queer theory, and central tenet of queer theory is that there is no binary, and everything, like every binary is false, or there is a attempt to break down the boundaries between, you know, what is masculine, what is feminine, what is gay, what is straight, because a lot of people are like basically straight but kind of gay, or basically gay but they have like these straight moments, like that's more of like the lived experience of sexuality, for example, and that kind of applies to everything, like even is this color more blue than it is red, or so everything is on a spectrum. And so my instinct when I am faced with that kind of dichotomy is like, oh, why should it be one or the other? Like it should kind of bleed into each other, like what is past and future. It's what's that Kurt Vonnegut book about Dresden bombings? Thank you. So there's that alien species that could go backwards and forwards through time. And I thought that's such an interesting conceit, that you can kind of like rewind your life and then fast forward your life. And the way that Kurt Vonnegut does it in that book is also really fascinating. And yeah, it's really interesting you point out Black humor, because so few people, even Koreans, see that in Korean literature. Like, yeah, you have to be a very, very sensitive reader to detect it, because I think a lot of people, when they hear K-pop or watch K-drama, they tend to consume it at the most superficial level, because it's so beautiful, it's so pretty, and it's fine to consume it at that level. But there's also a lot of darkness underneath the light. I just translated this book called A Magical Girl Retires, and it's about a girl who like realizes that she's a magical girl and has magical powers, and then she has to realize, like, you know, what her magical power specifically is. And it's this very like fun, bright book, but it starts off with her trying to commit suicide. And the concept of, and she meets all these magical girls, excuse me, and the way that magical girls come into their power is they face some kind of difficulty or hardship in their life, some kind of violent event even, and then it stimulates their magical power to come into being. It's like the universe trying to correct itself. And for my translator's note, I wrote that, oh, magical girls exist because justice does not. Because you know, Sailor Moon, who is the most iconic magical girl, she calls herself the champion of justice. She doesn't call herself, you know, a champion of power or whatever. She calls herself champion of justice. Like there's a very clear reason why magical girls are concerned with justice. It's because it doesn't exist in the world. And so it's always interesting to read that kind of thing into all of those like flashy, beautiful like surfaces, especially a country like South Korea, where on the surface everything just looks very pristine and trains run on time. I mean, we have bullet trains. I don't know why you guys don't have bullet trains. Like, just we sell our technology, buy it. It's really not that expensive. It's cheaper than Japan's bullet train. It's not as fast, but it's faster than, you know, what you have here. So yeah, so that preoccupation I kept having. I mean, even this book, like when we were marketing it, they were like, I didn't really think. I mean, I thought of it as science fiction, but my editor and everyone kept saying, oh, it's, you know, literary fiction. I'm like, okay, I'll take it. And Jeff Vandermeer was asked online, after I sold this book, Jeff Vandermeer asked online, Like, oh, so like, why are your books marketed as literary fiction and not science fiction? And then he answered, well, there's a very simple answer for that. Science fiction readers will go to the literary fiction section to look at the books. Literary fiction readers will not go to the science fiction section to look at the books. And because that snobbery exists, I just sell better by putting my books in literary fiction. And I'm like, wow, god damn, that dichotomy, like, and the fact that it's science fiction readers that break down that dichotomy. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's real. That's a real thing. I mean, is your book, do you know if your book is shelved in literary fiction or science fiction, or it depends on the bookstore, I guess?
Well, it just came out.
We'll have to look
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
I think it's a good opportunity to open up questions to the audience, if anyone has anything. Okay,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, I'll come in with the back.
Yeah.
Oh, I love your humble.
Thank you.
We'll often do both. When a book is both, we'll put it in both sections.
Thank you, Piers.
Thank you.
I don't get the credit for that.
Hi, thank you for amazing talk. And so I came to America like 10 years ago. So at this point, I consider myself a bilingual, not BI but BYE, because I don't feel like I am fluent in both, like neither Korean or English. So when I write anything, I have to like deliberately put effort to make it polished, to use precise word, like the word that like there's like really similar words, like but based on the context or like your intention, you have to like use a specific word. So when you talk about like how precise your word choices were in the story, but also at the same time, like you kind of like prefer like not to be too polished, like regarding your work. So I was like, oh, that sounds very contradictory in my head. So could you a little bit explain about that?
Sure, I would rather be interesting than beautiful. That's what it comes down to. If you read Bora Chung, she is completely uninterested in writing a beautiful sentence. She is more interested in making you laugh, horrifying you, grossing you out, or just being interesting. She's like, and you can sense her energy, like her glee in her writing. Like she's not like, oh, I'm going to do this pristine, beautiful, polished, whatever. Like she's not like that at all. And that's what I really love about her. I think, oh God, there's so many stories that I can tell about this. Like, I can't say, because this is going out to stream, I can't say which writer this is. You can ask me later when, yeah. But there's this famous Korean writer, and she is absolutely brilliant, like objectively brilliant. And I translate one of her editors, an editor who is also an author. And he told this podcast, so it's actually out of the public, but he told in the podcast that, oh wow, when I received her manuscript, it was full of typos and like it's ungrammatical Korean. And I was like, that is so cool to know. The really dirty secret about Korean is that no Korean really speaks perfect Korean except television announcers. And almost, like not even professors write perfect Korean. Like there's only one person in my acquaintance. I live in Korea, I went to Korean universities, the best Korean universities in fact, but I only know one person who writes perfect Korean. She's a reporter. And she's the only person I know who I would trust to give like my work, any writing I have in Korean, to look up typos. Like I published a book in Korean and I did a really good job and the editors did a really good job, but people are still going like, oh, isn't this a typo? Like no Korean writes perfect Korean anyway. So if we can anyway, then if you can't be perfect, you might as well be interesting. But it's being polished has never been a concern to me because I know that I can't. Like there are people who are very elegant and very refined and I envy them, but I know that I can't be that. And I just have to be something else. I have to be interesting in a different way. Like their elegance is interesting, but I can't be interesting that way. I have to be interesting in a different way. And that's what I always aim for, like when I'm writing, I don't know, it's just, there's a Linda Barry comic on this, and I think it's Salon, where she's like, her neighborhood can be divided into two different kinds of girls: the really rough tomboys and the really elegant girls who played with dolls and whatever. And there was a big divide. And she was friends with one of them, but then they had to be separated because her mother didn't like her and all of that. So yeah, I'm definitely with the tomboys. So.
Thank you, I love the answer.
Amen.
Hi. I loved how poetry is such a recurring theme throughout the book, and it like informs the consciousness of some of these beings. And the way you talked about it just now, clearly you have huge regard for poetry and its porousness. And I think I recently had a conversation with book friends about how a lot of us don't know how to read poetry, and we read it like it's hard for us, even though we like glimpse that humanness and the power of poetry. So I was wondering if you have advice for those of us, because I think poetry books don't necessarily do well in the publishing world. And so what advice do you have for those of us who like want to read poetry better?
Well, you guys are lucky because you guys are American, living in America, who can read American English, because some of the best poets now are American. So you have such a richness of poetic tradition and poetry. I don't even need to tell you like who to read. Just go to any poetry section, grab any book, and just look at like 10 books like at the poetry section, and then just like grab a couple that you feel like, oh, it's interesting. Like there are poetry podcasts as well. There's there are foundations. There's so many magazines. Like this country is so rich in poetry. It's completely ridiculous. I'm a trained Victorianist. In Victorian poetry, in fact. It's one of my more random facts, that that's what I wrote my thesis on, Victorian poetry. Because of it is fine, really, because if you read Possession, it's about Victorian poets, and I was like, oh wow, this is so cool. This is the coolest thing that I could think of studying, Victorian poetry. And I'm still very happy that I did it. Like, I did not do Complet, I did not do modern American novels like everyone else in my, although I love modern American novels, obviously I kind of wrote one. But yeah, I think so many things to say about poetry. I found poetry, especially in graduate school, it was just so much better to study poetry than prose. Not because there's anything wrong with prose, but poetry is so rich, and you can do so much analysis, and you can memorize an entire poem, and you can look at the entire thing as an entirety within a paper. Whereas with a novel, it's just so amorphous and so big, and every time I go back to like looking at novels in a kind of like a very critical way, I find myself like looking at it as like as a poetic thing. But I don't like, it helps if you know like, oh, a sonnet has so many lines, and this is a real rhyme, and this is a false rhyme, this is an I rhyme. Like it helps if you know those things. But I think for the most part, just having it just takes like this one poem where you read and then you realize, this is what poetry is. For example, this isn't my story, but this is Jory Graham. Is that how you pronounce her name? She's at Harvard. And she became a poetry expert when she was studying at the Sorbonne, I believe. And then she was walking by this classroom where the professor was reading out loud Proofrock, I believe. Love Song of JF or Proofrock by T.S. Eliot. And she fell in love with the rhythm and cadence of the poem. Like, you kind of need a moment like that where you fall in love with it. And in order to fall in love, you have to swipe right a lot. And this is the country to do it. Because again, America is such great poet. Like, my favorite poet is actually not a Victorian poet. She's American. She's Emily Dickinson. Yeah. I think it's very hard not to have that experience, that falling in love experience. So maybe start with Emily Dickinson and just like read it because they're short, they rhyme. There's a reason why each word is in its place. She has a very compelling personal story. I even like that silly Cynthia Nixon movie. I liked it. I don't know why no one else did, but yeah, so I think that's a very good place to start. But any modern poet like working now, so excuse me, so many compelling poets like from every race, every kind of gender, like such a richness here that it's such a shame that that poets are not more appreciated in this country of all countries. Yeah.
Come on.
Thank you, Anton. As a fellow Korean, now I'm really tempted to read your translated works, the corresponding in Korean to feel, in English to feel your textures. My question for you is that I know that you wrote your first book in Korean. It's an essay, but you wrote your English book in novel. Is there any intention? Is this any intention behind it? Why do you wrote a a fiction in English versus an essay in Korean?
Sure. So it was never my intention to write a Korean book. What happened was, like a little after, like during pandemic, like I had a Korean editor contact me saying like, oh, I would like to discuss a book, and I'm like, oh, I guess she wants to have a book translated to English, and then she's like, I will come all the way to Songdo, and I'm like, what? Are you crazy? And so she came all the way to Songdo during the pandemic, and we're sitting in a cafe, and she's like, blah 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 blah, and I'm listening to her. And I'm like, oh wait a minute, she wants me to write a book. And then she's like, yeah, like I want you to write a book about life as a translator. And I was like, why? Who would read that? I don't know if I will read that. And he's like, oh, you must have read some books written by translators. I'm like, oh, of course I've read like there's this Japanese translator that I really like, and she's written several books about her life as a translator. But I'm like, I can't write. You know, that would be so boring. Like, she's like, describe your day to me. I was like, I go to my home office and then I sit on my butt the whole day procrastinating, and maybe for 2 hours I might try to translate something, and then I moan and biatch to my husband that I worked all day. That's my day. That's how you get 2 Booker Prize nominations. And it's just like, no, I'm sure there's a very compelling story if you dig into it. And so I was like, okay, ma'am, I'm just gonna blah blah. So I wrote the book over the pandemic, and it had so much stuff in it. Like, there was this thing where I was learning how to drive, and my driving instructor was this political conservative, and we were having an argument, and then he said something where I was just so devastated by what he said. He was so against like free school lunches, and I'm like, you have 2 children, why are you against school lunches? And then he goes, well, I would rather that money go to educating my children so that they are not ashamed that their father is a driving instructor. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna shut the fuck up and drive because I have to say I felt so terrible. Like, I don't know what that has to do with my life as a translator, but my editor loved it. She's like, this essay is gonna open the book. So that book did well. It's in several printings. So it was really like someone wanted to hear the story, so I wrote the book. Another book by another translator, she does subtitles. Like, she wrote the book that I think everyone expected me to write, where she writes all these things about sentences, grammar, and she's a very elegant person. And again, I'm not an elegant person, so I'm just gonna write about stuff like what I say and do. And so it was really interesting that, oh, he's a Booker Prize whatever, and she's a subtitler who does like Ben Affleck movies or whatever, and then like, but the content is like switched. And yeah, so that was interesting. With English, I always wanted to be an English novelist because I fell in love with English literature first. Yeah, Korean literature, it was more like in high school, but ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be a writer, and that meant writing in English. Also, it's much more complicated, as you know, to become a Korean writer because there's the Dungdan system, and then you have to be commissioned, and then basically there's a lot of hoops that you have to jump. You also have to jump hoops for English, but it's a much bigger market, and it's more open, although it's very gatekeepy as well, but it's still more open than it is in Korea. And so it just made more sense for me to write in English. And then I thought, oh, I kind of want to, like Bruno Dantas Lobato, like she writes in Spanish and English, so I was like, I can do that. So I am under contract to deliver a Korean novel, and I have written about 20% of it, but I don't know, it's not going super well. It's fun. It's fun. This book was written very lazily because I basically wrote about things that I knew. But the Korean book, for some reason, it wants to be a book about painting and painters. I don't know that much about them. And so it's a composite novel. In the first chapter, this woman is pushed into a painting and she falls into a different universe, and yeah, it keeps getting into these like weird things where I don't know. So yeah. But I do want to keep writing it, and I do want to keep writing in Korean and English.
Hi. I have seen mentioned that you also have a background in studying psychology.
Oh yes.
And also, I have gone through a portion of this around this, and I have seen the involvement about self, and also on the idea about psychology, or do you have any that is influenced by psychology or even philosophy in this book also? And if you have, do you have this idea prior to writing that you want to address in the book, or does that just grow organically as you are writing?
That's a really good question. Are you a psychology student?
No, I'm just interested in reading some.
Okay, cool. Psychology is a great undergrad major, for example, because it's so interdisciplinary. So I have 4 college degrees. One of them is psychology. And excuse me. So I took psychology in high school. I loved it. I wanted to take it in college, but my parents were so against it, so I double majored in it instead. And my high school psychology teacher was adamantly against the neuroscientific paradigm. I went to Korea University for undergrad, and at Kodae, they are very pro-neuroscience. And so I basically took only neuroscience courses. So technically, I have a psychology degree, but I actually have a neuroscience degree. And it was really, really interesting to see how neuroscientists try to grapple with the material reality of synapses and cells and whatnot, and also how this translates into things like the self, consciousness, and whatnot. And there are many, many arguments, many, many paradigms surrounding that. The most fascinating one that I found was the one by Damasio. This is, I believe he's Italian. He's a neuroscientist named Damasio, and he defined the self as a narrative that we tell ourselves. That it's a story. The self is a story, and it has to be told into being. It is a performative, and this is a neuroscientist. He's not a humanities person, but this is a very humanities attitude that he came up with after studying, neuroscience and fMRI imaging and whatnot. And so I used his idea of there's a line in here that says something like, oh, maybe the self is a story that we tell ourselves. That's plagiarized from Damasio, basically. It's only plagiarism if 6 out of 10 words are the same. I also have a law degree, so I know what the definition of plagiarism is. But that idea is a Damasio idea. There's also the ship of Theseus idea, where if you replaced every single neuron in your brain, would you still be yourself? And our cells are, I think it's like every 7 years, your entire body replaces like all of your cells. And it's an interesting philosophical question to grapple with, because I feel like I'm the same person I was like 7 years ago. I still feel like, I'm 22 years old or whatever, and people tell me to act my age, and I'm like, no. And that means that despite the fact that every component of myself has been replaced, that it's really not my essential being, myself, my body, that defines who I am. It's the self that this body produces that is my real self. And this is a very neuroscientific idea. I know it's also a very humanities kind of subjectivity idea. I didn't really do subjectivity studies in grad school because we have a very canonized, anyway, so it's a very long, stupid political grad student story. But it's a very neuroscientific idea, like everything that has to do with this book. And I know that it's also a very, very kind of common preoccupation now because I just translated the science fiction book. God, is this under embargo? Can I say it on live stream? It's under embargo. But there are a lot of like neuroscience ideas in that where what part of your, like if you remove what part of your brain, like would you still be yourself, for example? And there are a lot of neuroscience studies where, you know, people who lose like literally like one entire hemisphere of their brains is still, you know, acting and functioning like they normally do, as long as they get some therapy and then they stimulate the neuroplasticity. And so yeah, it's an endlessly fascinating field, neuroscience and neural behavior and, you know, behavioral genetics, and you know, it's a very rich field, and a lot of those ideas I hope inform the book. Although I feel like because it's been a hot minute since I graduated college, I'm sure a lot of the ideas are kind of outdated now. But Damasio published the book 2 years ago, so his ideas must still be kind of still. Oh, Quran, I don't know. Yeah.
I think that's it. Did you have any last words, Michelle?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry you had to wait. Please blame Buttigieg. Because I do.
It was very well worth the wait. Thank you both so much for being here. We're gonna have a signing now. We've got books in the back. Anton will be up here. Just form the line right over there on his side. And have a lovely evening. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.